Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. After playing Hatred, I expected perhaps that I'd have a little bit more of an emotional reaction than I did. I found myself not actually caring at all about the violence that was going on the screen, which is perhaps in stark contrast to what we'd been hearing prior to its release, that this was one of the most sadistic and evil games to come out in a very, very long time. Now, one would think if that were actually true, it would induce some sort of emotional reaction, and yet I found myself not really feeling any. And I thought to myself, why is that? Have I become desensitized to fantasy violence as a whole? And my conclusion, after thinking about it for a while, is that no, I haven't, but there are certain ways in which to present violence which can evoke an emotional response from the player, and there are other ways which do not. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about how that works. I'd like to talk about violence in terms of storytelling and emotional investment and immersion with the player. And also, I'd like to highlight games which don't do that very well. Firstly, though, why are games in general so violent? Well, there are actually a great deal of games that are not, but gaming is perhaps known for a large number of fairly violent titles. Now, the question is why? Well, in my view, it really comes down to the idea that gaming is a contest of some description. It's a challenge, and the challenge is presented by the game for the player to complete, or in more recent years, the challenge is presented by another player, and there is some kind of contest, a test of strength. Now, tests of strength have existed for thousands and indeed hundreds of thousands of years, and the most obvious example, of course, would be the gladiatorial arenas in Rome. The idea that gladiators were sent in to fight to the death in a blood sport for the entertainment of the masses. And when you boil it down, it is simply a contest. It is a challenge. It is a sport, a blood sport, but a sport nonetheless. Now, of course, as we have evolved as a human race, we believe that perhaps having people murder each other for our entertainment in an arena is not a very good idea. And yet, we've still retained the element of violence in many competitive sports, including, of course, boxing, wrestling, mixed martial arts, and so on and so forth. And we have a fairly natural translation into video games simply because we have a fantasy medium where this idea of a blood sport being unacceptable ceases to be a factor. Because, of course, the characters on the screen are not real. We can act out these fantasies in a safe and harmless environment. As countless studies have stated, violence in video games does not cause violent behavior in real life. We are acting out fantasies in a safe environment. One of the easiest contests to create in a video game environment is, of course, the idea of a deathmatch, or the notion that one character must kill another in order to advance, and they must do so either with some sort of martial arts, or with a melee weapon, a ranged weapon, anything along those lines, or even going as far as to jump on their head. You know, Mario is actually a violent game, if you think about it. If you boil what violence is down to the bare essentials, down to its bare bones, it is a contest of strength. It is about eliminating your opponent in order to advance, and that's what Mario is. I mean, for God's sake, this guy throws fireballs around as well as curb stomping people into the floor, or should I say mushrooms into the floor, which is perhaps why we're less offended by it. Whatever the case, violence makes sense in terms of many game mechanics. It makes sense because you're putting opposition in front of the player. You are creating a challenge, and that challenge has arms and legs and, more often than not, an assault rifle, and is going to try his hardest to prevent you from proceeding. And it seems to work pretty well. It's relatively easy to create a challenge involving violence within video games, which is why we see so many of them. However, regardless of all the media furor, which inexplicably still exists to this day after decades of arguing on this particular subject, we have plenty of games that have huge amounts of violence and yet don't really seem to evoke any sort of emotional response within the player whatsoever. And Hatred is a prime example of that, and I was thinking to myself, why? Why is it that, despite the fact I'm playing a spree killer, and I'm murdering innocent people who are supposedly begging for their lives, why is it that I don't feel anything? And yet, in other games, I have felt genuinely guilty for certain actions that I've performed. I'm obviously not desensitized completely to this idea, but what's the difference between a game that can make me feel that way and a game like Hatred which does not? I was thinking about some of the games which have excessive amounts of violence within them. or that are indeed just focused on almost pure violence, and why exactly I didn't feel anything while performing these particular acts. And I came up with a number of reasons. 1, the lack of premeditation. Now, as much as the threadbare story of Hatred says, yes, you've been thinking about this for a while and preparing in your basement, and then finally you go out on your murderous killing spree, the storytelling doesn't indicate any premeditation, and more to the point, the premeditation is not something that you as a player partake in. Yes, the character on the screen may have premeditated it, but he maybe did so through a cutscene. There was a lack of interactivity there, and there was a lack of agency in said premeditation. When you make your way outside of your house and start shooting people, it's immediate. There is no time for thought, there is no time for consideration of your actions, and even if you just stand there, the cops will come and force you into a confrontation very, very quickly. You basically have no choice. And that comes on to the second point, the lack of choice in what you're actually doing. It's very difficult to create emotional investment in the player if this is the only thing that they can do. Because I feel that as a player, I very much adapt to the environment and the rule set that the game is presenting me. I'm a very mechanically focused gamer, but I also really enjoy theme. It's a great example here, Dungeon Keeper. A game which touted that it was good to be bad. And in theory, you should feel kind of guilty for torturing and murdering these heroes, and yet within the bounds of that game, you don't. Why? Well, there's a number of reasons. 1, the comedy aspect. 2, because you just don't have a choice. The rule set of that game says these supposed heroes are in fact invaders, and they're here to present you a challenge. And if you do not defeat them, you will lose. And of course, the desire of every gamer is not to lose, because games are inherently a challenge that you can win or lose. So, in the bounds of something like Hatred, or in the confines of Dungeon Keeper, or say Carmageddon, I don't feel guilty for those innocent deaths. The game has given me no choice. The rule set dictates I must kill this for points, so I will go and kill this for points. And that is an inherent dehumanizing element. The mechanics and the theme and the rule set and the environment and the universe that they've put me in have dehumanized the enemies to the point where they are mere targets for points. And I think that there's no real escaping that if you're going to create a game that is so limited. There are so many violent video games, and there's actually, in my opinion, very little difference between gunning down supposed innocent civilians in Hatred and gunning down locusts in Gears of War. Because in both games, you are required to kill a certain number of enemies in order to advance. That's the challenge of the game. And at that point, it doesn't matter what the targets are. They are merely targets that the game is presenting you. The game has presented you with a shooting gallery. And you don't care. You have no reason to care. There's a lack of genuine consequence within those games. There's no reason to be upset for what you're doing because the game is actively rewarding you for it. It's not telling you in any way that this is a wrong thing to do. In fact, it's saying this is the only right thing to do. There's also a lack of investment in the characters that you are eliminating. And of course, there's a number of reasons for that, the most obvious being there is zero character development in most of the enemies that you are fighting. They are merely grunts, they have no backstory whatsoever. So you have no reason to be emotionally invested in what happens to them, ergo it's very easy to dehumanize them to the point where they just become pixels for points. And that sounds kind of brutal, doesn't it? It sounds a bit sadistic, but in reality we are dealing with a fantasy here. So the dehumanization of things which aren't real in the first place isn't necessarily a bad thing. The dehumanization of something that is, well, that's a different matter entirely, but we are within the realms of fiction. There's a reason why we don't care about the thousands dead in the great battles of Game of Thrones, or, for instance, The Lord of the Rings, and yet we do care about the death of Boromir. Why do we care about the death of Boromir? Because he had character development. He was built up as a major character, and he died in a heroic way. These are all ways to make you feel something for that character, but I don't feel anything for the orcs. I don't feel anything even for the good guys. That's the thing. I don't feel anything for the dead humans and elves and dwarves. I don't feel anything for them because they are faceless. They are just members of an army. They're faces in the crowd. There's zero character development behind them. I have no emotional investment. But I do care about Boromir. I do care about various characters in Game of Thrones because the development is there. Can games actually develop characters in such a way? Well, I think that they can. And I think there's one game which provides an interesting contradiction, and that is Grand Theft Auto. I mentioned Hatred, and I mentioned Carmageddon. These are two extremely violent games that involve killing innocent civilians for points. They're required as part of the objective. Indeed, there are game modes within Carmageddon where that's the only way to win. So, as I said before, the rules of the environment clearly state that that's the only way to win, so you perceive it as a challenge and you dehumanize your target. GTA is a curious case, because GTA 5 in particular has elements of both. I don't feel bad when I run over civilians in GTA. In fact, I'm sure all of us have gone on a rampage, or indeed, we've taken the rampage challenges, which involve us just murdering people, the same perhaps with Saints Row. And yet, there's a scene in GTA 5 which has become infamous, which does make people feel very uncomfortable, and that is, of course, the torture scene. Why does that make you feel uncomfortable? Because there is a narrative backing it up. There's no narrative backing up you running over random civilians. The characters that you're running over aren't even characters. There's no effort to develop them into characters. And yet, the character you're torturing, he reacts like a real human being would. You start to empathize with him. He has some character development. Not much, but he has some character development. He's not faceless, and as soon as you put a face to the violence, it makes it much, much more difficult to stomach. And that's where violence can be powerful punctuation, even in a game which involves mass slaughter, absolute carnage, and it was one of the most violent games on the market. You can still create scenes which are shocking, disturbing, and difficult to partake in because of the way that you have delivered the narrative. It's a powerful piece of punctuation in a sea of pointless, mindless violence. And indeed, it's violence with a purpose. A distinction needs to be made between violence as a game objective, i.e. killing pixels for points, and violence for a narrative purpose. I think one is infinitely more effective than the other. If you were to boil down the violence of Hatred, you might as well call it Robotron. It's exactly the same. You are gunning down wave after wave of assailants, one way or the other. And yet a single torture sequence within Grand Theft Auto can result in emotional investment from the player. Remember what I said earlier about premeditation? Remember what I said earlier about genuine consequence? That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. That torture sequence is premeditated. Interestingly enough, you're not given a choice as to whether or not you wish to do it, because you've got to do it if you wish to advance the story. And I think that when properly done, you can evoke emotional responses through violence via either giving a choice to the player or by forcing a player to do something that they don't necessarily want to do. Both can be effective if done properly, and I'll talk a little bit about giving the choice of violence in a moment. As soon as you give the player time to reflect on their actions and really think about what they're doing, you increase the possibility that the player will become emotionally invested and will actually consider his actions. In a game like Hatred, there is no consideration of your actions to be had. None. Because that is the only action that you are allowed to take. I'm not concerned about the lives of pedestrians in Carmageddon because the game objectives require me to kill them. I'm not concerned about it in Postal because the game objectives require me to kill them, and that is all the game is. That's all the game really involves. And of course, we could talk about the idea that Carmageddon is very much kind of comedy violence and so on and so forth, but I think that's another discussion for another time. There's that key difference. You know, the more I think about it, the more obvious it becomes that many games do a hell of a job of creating this objective-based murder and desensitizing you to it by dehumanizing the targets, because that's what they become, targets. And there's even visual indicators and things like level design even play into this. And you might be thinking, well, what the hell are you talking about? Well, here's an idea. If something's highlighted in red, does that become a dehumanizing visual element? Because that's the game telling me, this is enemy, kill. It's giving me a very specific instruction, and it's also putting a giant label in the form of a glowing red outline saying, this is your enemy, it's gonna shoot you unless you shoot him. It's an interesting idea, isn't it? What about level design? The idea that anything that's put in front of you, anything that spawns in front of you and comes towards you and gets in the way of you traveling from point A to point B is a target. It's not something to consider the feelings of. It's not something to feel guilty about. And yet, there is one game that does manage to create a sense of emotional investment in a target that's in your way. And that's Spec Ops: The Line. Now, how does it do it? There's an infamous scene, and this is a spoiler, so If you do wish to still play Spec Ops The Line, I would recommend that you keep an eye on the spoiler warning on the screen, because that will go away when I stop talking about this particular scene. There's a scene whereby in order to progress, you are forced to use white phosphorus on civilians. That's the only way that you can progress. And I was thinking to myself, why exactly is this scene so powerful? Why exactly is this scene emotional? And why does it make me feel sick to my stomach when I've just gunned down hundreds of people prior to getting to it? Well, again, I think it's a moment of punctuation in otherwise meaningless violence. Slaughtering hundreds of enemies that are fighting back on the way to get to this sequence feels normal. I mean, it feels natural. You don't really feel anything, and you just mow your way through them because that's what you've got to do in order to progress in the game. And then the game throws a curveball at you and says, look, in order to progress in the game, you've got to do something really horrible and unpleasant that is very different to what you were doing before. You're forced into a situation where you have to kind of make a choice. It's interesting, it's actually a fake choice. You can choose not to do it, but you will lose the game if you choose not to do it. So the game is almost dangling a choice in front of you and saying, yeah, look, you are the guy that chose to do this. We didn't make you do it. We didn't make you do it. That was all you. You made that call. You're a horrible person. It's a nice little narrative trick, really. And it's effective. It works very, very well. And you've also got to bear in mind that up to that point, there's a build-up in the character. There's a build-up in the narrative. You're built up from being your standard white-bread American military hero into a murderous monster throughout the game. And that's even reflected in the way that your character responds and his character barks. They get more and more psychotic the further you get into the game after witnessing and committing various atrocities throughout. The game is making you question whether or not what you're doing is right. And many games don't ever give you the opportunity to question what you're doing. They just don't have room for it in the narrative because it's just not part of it. It's not even a consideration within the rule set of the game, which again is why hatred is an ineffectual statement when it comes to violence in video games. I don't think it was meant to be a statement, honestly. I don't think it was meaning to say anything. I don't think it has to say anything. I don't think most games have to say anything. It's kind of cool when they do, but it's also nice to be able to just sit down with a video game and do some mindless stuff and not really have to worry about whether or not there's a message buried within there. And more often than not, when you see a game attempt that, it just doesn't do it very well because this is an emerging industry. We're in our awkward teenage years and we're not as developed as other forms of media. There's another game that sprang to mind when I was thinking about hatred and trying to think, look, what else has been that sadistic? And there's a game which I view as even more sadistic, which is, of course, Manhunt. Manhunt does some very interesting things when it comes to its portrayal of violence. And it taps into some of the things that I was saying earlier. Whereas hatred has a lack of premeditation, Manhunt is all premeditation because it's a stealth game. You are given time to think about your actions. You are slowly sneaking up on characters. And the strange thing is that these characters are criminals, and yet you hear some conversations between them. You actually hear a little bit of character development. And it's a little bit of a trick, most of it. It's an emotional trick to try and kind of pull on your heartstrings, but sometimes it's effective. We hear criminals conversing about, like, hey, I'm just going to go home to my family after this, and just even little tidbits of character development help to humanize the targets, and you slowly sneaking up on them just instills this nasty feeling in your stomach. And there's even a mechanic within that game which makes it even worse. The idea that the longer you hold the button down, the more brutal the kill will be. And you know that you're standing behind someone waiting to end their life, and you're deliberately making the decision to kill them in an even more gruesome way. You're even taking a risk to do it. That's sadistic. A single kill with a plastic bag or a shard of glass in Manhunt is more effective than burning down an entire convenience store full of screaming, immolated civilians in hatred, or indeed running over a conga line of pedestrians in Grand Theft Auto. To go to less extreme examples, you can talk about the kind of choices that you sometimes have to make in RPGs, where more often than not, they attempt to make the good choice the less beneficial one, and they force you into a situation where you have to ask yourself, are you willing to do something immoral in order to receive a reward? Games like Hatred don't really do that. They don't give you a choice. you can't be the good guy in a game like that. You can't be the good guy in Carmageddon or indeed in GTA. But when you're able to be the good guy and you make the conscious decision not to be, now that can have some very powerful emotional effects on the player because they become invested because they are the ones that made that decision. The idea of player responsibility, and those games give you the ability to become responsible for your actions, whereas you can't be held responsible for your actions in a game like Hatred because you have literally no other choice. It's the only thing you're able to do. The game removes the element of responsibility by limiting its mechanics. There's also the idea of corrupting an otherwise good character in order to gain some kind of temporary reward, or even because it's the optimal thing to do. That's one of the most evil tricks that is more often than not played by developers of RPGs, where they exploit the min-maxing nature of the player and say, if you want to min-max, you're gonna have to do something evil. The Souls games do that from time to time, where it's perhaps optimal to kill a character that is otherwise not attempting to harm you, because maybe he drops a good item or gives you some kind of benefit. That game doesn't really have a morality system per se, but it's still forcing you into a situation where you must make a moral decision in order to min-max. And I know the urge of many gamers is to min-max and be the very, very best, because of course they view games as a challenge. And yet, that's one of the nasty little curveballs that can be thrown at you by a developer, which is why games are such an interesting medium, because they mix this idea of a challenge, a simple contest, a competition, with something that can make you emotionally invested and actually create some really interesting moral quandaries within the player, which is why I think that eventually video games will become the most powerful medium that we have. Not every game has to be that, just as not every film has to be Citizen Kane. Not every book must be War and Peace. Not every piece of music must be Beethoven's Ninth. In fact, it's best that the majority of them are not, because that means when something special does come along, it stands out from the crowd and it creates those truly special moments. And those special moments don't necessarily have to be pleasant. Oh no, absolutely not. I'm a firm believer in the idea that unpleasant things should be part of media, because they do evoke those emotional responses and they're a powerful tool to be used sparingly within storylines. And when a video game doesn't use that kind of thing sparingly, the violence becomes meaningless. And at that point, I believe that there really is no reason whatsoever to get up in arms over meaningless violence, because it is meaningless. There's no reason to become upset over a game which involves murdering hundreds of pixel people. There's no meaning to it. There's no rhyme or reason. There's no moral quandary on offer there. Those games, including Hatred as far as I'm concerned, are utterly harmless, because they don't have anything to say, and they don't give you any choices, and they don't make you reflect on your actions as a player. And indeed, the immersion factor in those games is often fairly minimal as a direct result. And you don't necessarily have to be immersed in a game in order to have fun. I'm the kind of person that can enjoy pure mechanical rampages. You know, a good fighting system is often enough to make me rate a game very highly. It doesn't matter if the story's terrible, it doesn't matter if I'm not emotionally invested, as long as it's got a good combat system, really solid, enjoyable, fluid mechanics, and presents me with a challenge of dexterity, a challenge of wits, then that's satisfying to me as a gamer. And if you were to boil games down to what they were before video games, things like chess is a pure battle of wits and strategy. Chess is pure mechanics, essentially, and yet we view it as one of the finest games of all time. Video games are a curious hybrid between the storytelling techniques of various non-interactive mediums and the element of challenge present in traditional sports and, of course, traditional board and card games. That's what makes video games truly interesting. You can do both, and yet that also presents a series of unique challenges to the game developer, which is why we get so many misses when we see games try and evoke some sort of emotion, and yet they're just not able to do it, because we just don't necessarily know how yet. Few games have managed to pull it off in a really meaningful way. I still believe that Brothers is the game that has affected me the most emotionally out of any video game ever, because it is this such unique melding of mechanics and storytelling. And that hasn't really been imitated as of yet, at any rate, but I think that Brothers shows us the way. when it comes to really immersing players into a game world. And violence can be used that way too. I'm not the only person to say this. There have been several commentators that have said, look, dialing back the violence can be a more effective method of storytelling than just going all out. I think we've got to the point where gamers are almost incapable of being shocked by massacres and huge amounts of violence. Joseph Stalin, of all people, said, "A single death is a tragedy. 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic." It's a very applicable idea, isn't it? The human brain can't really process the idea of individuality within a crowd of 1,000,000 people, and yet, if they know a person, if they feel that a character has been built up over time, and then something horrible happens to them, then yes, you do feel a degree of sympathy because you feel an emotional connection to that person, to that character. Now, here's the conclusion, in my opinion, on violence in video games. There is no wrong answer. There's no reason why games like Hatred can't exist. There's no reason why games like Carmageddon, Grand Theft Auto, Postal, Mortal Kombat, and all manner of other violent video games cannot exist. And they should. Why not? People enjoy them. And it's harmless. We know it's harmless. Science has said it's harmless. There's nothing wrong with some good old fantasy violence. There's nothing wrong with shooting fictional people. Things that do not exist. And there's plenty of enjoyment to be had there. But I think if you wish to advance video games as a medium, developers have to start thinking about using violence as a way to invest players into the story, into the narrative, and emotionally into their game world. And the way that you do that is often with less violence, rather than more. As opposed to trying to shock players, perhaps what we need is patience. Perhaps what we need is more build-up. We need that premeditation. We need that element of choice. We need genuine consequence, investment, and we need the story to battle against desensitization by resisting the urge to oversaturate. All these uses of violence are entirely valid, as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't matter, because Call of Duty can coexist with Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. The wonderful thing about our expanding game market is that we can have games which express all manner of different ideas. The wonderful thing about the rise of indie development is that we can have games that are so niche that they wouldn't even be considered by large publishers. An individual can create a powerful experience all on their own. What we're seeing is a systematic demolition of the rules when it comes to what you can and cannot do within video games, which is why I urge everybody to stop and think when they turn around and say something like, "This game should not have been made." It's only by pushing the boundaries that we discover where this medium can really go. It's only by pushing the boundaries that we're able to see this medium reach its true potential. And some of that journey is going to be unpleasant. There are going to be mistakes made along the way. There are going to be things that some people find offensive. But hey, we're adults, and we can choose the media that we wish to consume and that which we wish to ignore. As a developer, you can choose to be as violent as you damn well please, but ask yourself whether or not it actually enhances your game. Does it make your game any better? What is it exactly as a developer that you are trying to achieve with your game? And will your inclusion of violence and your implementation of it actually help you reach that goal? Violence, alongside many other unpleasant things, should, in my opinion, be embraced as a method of storytelling and as a way to advance our chosen medium. And let's be honest, because sometimes it's just fun to kill pixels, and there's nothing wrong with that. My name's been TotalBiscuit, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.